Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome into Dom Time. You know, people talk a lot about Lance Armstrong this week. They talk about the NFL playoffs, at least I was doing that, but they also talk about the flu. And about 2 weeks ago, as I was sitting here, I started to feel it coming on. I lied to myself and said it's not the flu. It's just a little tickle in my throat, just a little cold. Well, we want to take your calls tonight, and we want to talk about all aspects of this. Is this a particularly bad season, flu season? Are you really seeing more people that are having to take time off? And to do that with us tonight, we have somebody with real expertise in this, someone that not only is an MD, but has her PhD, but she also has 3 little children. So I think that qualifies her as an expert to deal with this. Dr. Shafinaz Akhtar joins us from Virtua Hospital System. Dr. Akhtar, thank you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Doc. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this important issue.
Well, I have to tell viewers at home, you were working me over pretty good prior to this. I feel as if I should get a flu shot here on the set, even though I had the flu.
Exactly.
It still would benefit me at a certain period of time to get a shot.
Absolutely. I mean, influenza vaccination, although far from perfect, is by far the best thing that we have done now to reduce the rates and severity of influenza illness in this country. And I can't stress enough how many people are hospitalized and die every year from influenza alone. It's a very serious disease.
How does a person die, though, other than we know that it's somebody very young or elderly? Would someone be at risk, normal health, normal situation? What happens?
Well, it's really interesting. 2009, do you remember our swine flu pandemic
who could
year?
Forget? Right,
exactly, the hysteria about that. So that was actually a year where we were seeing young people dying disproportionately with influenza. And it was much like what was happening in 1918, where there was this enormous global pandemic that decimated millions of lives. Young people without any immune response or any immune memory of a new influenza can have a very aggressive inflammatory response, and that inflammatory response itself can lead to death. So influenza alone, with no other factors in it, and there's many other factors that also play in, can itself cause a significant amount of mortality and morbidity.
Let's talk about if you think the flu's coming on. How do we distinguish? I mean, the body ache was the sign to me that told me, and I guess fever is the other usually. It's a warning sign of it versus a cold. What should one do to make a distinguishing factor between those two about getting up and just fighting through the cold versus having to do something else?
Well, one of the main things that you should be aware of is risk factors going into that. So you already talked about the very young, less than 2. Right. The old, of course, that definition becomes more problematic these days, but the CDC uses over 65, okay? So, you know, many 65-year-olds, my mother, would not say she's of the elderly.
Is Mom watching tonight?
Yes,
good. I know
yes,
she's
yes.
watching the
well,
kids.
She's watching
so
all
good.
3 kids, so hopefully,
it's
you
a
know,
very youthful grandma.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly. So, you know, over 65, and so those are risk factors that we think about of any significant change in their baseline in terms of fever, upper respiratory symptoms, lower respiratory symptoms, or a change of mental status that, you know, have higher mortality from these. But also there's some pre-existing conditions that become problematic, diabetes and heart disease being very significant ones, HIV infection, even with perfect control. So well-controlled HIV patients have much more serious courses of influenza illness than would be expected of an otherwise young, healthy 30-year-old.
Now, we'll talk about the flu shot more, and we'll take calls on that as a first line of defense. The thing that I know in talk radio that I told you generates tremendous amount of calls, and you're an expert. You went into the infectious disease field, so you've seen all this stuff at some microbe level, like this desk in front of me. I'm sure is a germ factory extraordinary, even though they wipe it down, correct? I mean, is the desk really one of the germiest areas? We hear that all the time.
You know, it really depends on the particular pathogen. So there's some pathogens that can stick around, and these are called fomites in the world of medicine. So it's kind of inanimate, hard surfaces. There's some pathogens that can stick around and survive for a long time. Some spores, a big one being an infectious diarrhea called Clostridium difficile. We've been able to grow it in labs weeks after the patient has left the room. Influenza, fortunately, Dom, is a very delicate virus. So it is not of that type. So influenza really requires a closer contact, or or a exposure, much more person-to-person exposure.
Are you a handshaker? My doctor made a big deal about each time that I went to her twice, of reaching out and planting that hand and shaking that hand and around it, just to reassure she was going to wash right away.
Right, exactly. And and I am a handshaker, but I'm a fastidious hand washer.
How many times a day? Because we need specifics, Dr. Akhtar, to give us at home.
Right.
I would start off, I bet I wash my hands with soap first of all, 5 to 6 times a day, and I use hand sanitizer another 5 or 6, I'd say. Is that within the range?
I think that's a very good amount.
Is that a Howie Mandel range I'm starting to get to?
I think the real thing is, I mean, for me, it's easy because I go in, every patient room I go in, I use hand sanitizer, going in, and I use hand sanitizer, Dom, coming out.
How about for the average person, though?
Time.
What would you recommend?
So what I would really recommend is any sort of exposure. If somebody is near you coughing, and you are in a similar environment, get a little hand sanitizer. If you're in an environment where there's little children and little children's toys are one of the worst reservoirs, as you can imagine, of any of these respiratory viruses. When they're swabbed, they come up as, petri dishes. If you're touching things, hand sanitizer, before and after, hand shaking and hand sanitizer makes good sense.
You can get in right here. Give us a call right now. We'll continue talking about the flu shot. We're also going to talk about in your home the various things that are around you right now. The doctor just mentioned kids' toys. My wife is a pre-K teacher. You can imagine what's that like. I have to go in the house like this when I come home. We'll take those calls and talk more about the flu next on Dom Time.